The Committee on Oversight and Reform chamber hummed with low murmurs as senators sifted through their documents, exchanged brief remarks, and adjusted their microphones. The media had packed the room, C-SPAN, CNN, and Fox News all broadcasting. Live. A large screen prominently displayed the session title in bold letters, Special Hearing, Investigating Immigration Fraud Allegations Against Reparer Ilhan Omar. At the center of it all, Chairman Marcus Russell adjusted his glasses before striking his gavel firmly against the desk. The sharp thud echoed through the chamber, instantly silencing the chatter. Leaning slightly forward, he scanned the assembled. Lawmakers before locking eyes with the cameras broadcasting the proceedings nationwide, zooming in as Chairman Marcus Russell spoke, his voice steady and authoritative. "This hearing of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform is now in session," he declared. "Today, we are gathered to address a grave matter. Serious allegations that Representative Ilhan Omar engaged in immigration fraud by marrying her own brother." A ripple of murmurs swept through the chamber. The cameras panned across the faces of lawmakers. Some remained expressionless, others raised their eyebrows, while a few flipped through their prepared statements. Russell continued, his tone sharpening. "We live in a fast-moving world. The news cycle churns forward relentlessly, stories fade, issues are forgotten. But some things, ladies and gentlemen, should never be swept under the rug." Chairman Russell's eyes flickered toward Ilhan Omar, who sat composed, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, yet braced. He lifted a thick file and dropped it onto the desk with a resounding slap. "This is not a new story," he stated firmly. "These allegations have circulated for years, yet no serious investigation has ever taken place." Leaning back in his chair, he clasped his hands together as the atmosphere in the chamber grew tense. The cameras captured Caroline Leavitt, her sharp gaze cutting through the room like a blade, while Ethan Caldwell, former immigration official Ethan Caldwell, sat quietly, exuding the confidence of a man holding damning evidence. Further down the table, Abda Hakim Osman, a key member of the Somali community, clenched his hands, bracing himself for what promised to be an explosive testimony. Chairman Russell shifted in his seat, picking up a sheet of paper. He adjusted his microphone and this time directed his full attention to Omar. "Representative Omar," he said, his voice deliberate, each word carefully measured. "Let's begin." The tension in the room was thick, palpable, the kind that made every pause in conversation feel heavier than it should. Caroline Leavitt leaned forward, her manicured fingers drumming lightly. Against the wooden table before her, Caroline Leavitt's manicured fingers drummed lightly. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips as she adjusted the microphone, her voice laced with both amusement and exasperation. "You know," she began, her tone casual yet cutting, "it's funny how the media never seems to forget a single misstep when it involves a conservative. Yet, when it comes to the left, it's as if someone hits the delete button." She let the statement linger for a moment before leaning in further, her sharp gaze sweeping across the chamber. "We've been talking a lot about immigration lately. Immigration, fraud, mass deportations, the crackdown on..." Caroline Leavitt's voice remained sharp as she continued. "The media has been all over it, dissecting every single policy shift under this administration. But there's something, or someone, that seems to have slipped through the cracks." She swiftly picked up a sheet of paper, flipping it around for effect before placing it back down with deliberate care. "Twitter has noticed." She exhaled, sharply, as if the absurdity of the situation was almost too much to bear. "And for once, I have to say, they're right." Her gaze narrowed as she turned toward Omar, who remained stoic, her expression unreadable. "Because while everyone is busy discussing deportations, and while we're focused on fixing our immigration system, there's a rather pressing question that keeps resurfacing." She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle before delivering the punchline. "Did a sitting member of Congress commit immigration fraud?" A murmur rippled through the room. The Ilhan Omar scandal. There it was, spoken plainly, no more dancing around the topic. Leavitt folded her hands together, her voice dropping just slightly. "And I think we all know why that's a question worth answering. A low hum of voices murmured through the chamber, the weight of Caroline Levitt's words still lingering in the air, pressing down like a storm cloud just before the downpour. The tension in the room threatened to crack. Then a deliberate throat clearing cut through the silence. "Mr. Chairman," Ethan Caldwell, a former senior official from the Department of Homeland Security, adjusted the microphone in front of him. His tone was measured, practiced. He had been in enough hearings to know exactly how these moments played out. "There have been persistent allegations that Representative Ilhan Omar engaged in immigration fraud." He flipped through his files, scanning for the document he needed before glancing up. To put it plainly, she is accused of marrying her own brother to facilitate his immigration process and secure a green card. A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the chamber. A camera lens zoomed in on Omar's face, but her expression remained unreadable. "This is not a new story," Caldwell continued, adjusting his glasses. "These allegations have been circulating for years, but now, all of a sudden, evidence and footage from as far back as 2021 and 2022 have resurfaced." He glanced toward the committee members. "It's going viral again, and people are starting to ask, why hasn't this been fully investigated?" The hush in the room was almost suffocating. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats, while others leaned in, whispering. Low whispers spread among the lawmakers, murmured exchanges just beneath the surface. Caldwell placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. His voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "I believe it's time we stop ignoring this." A pause. Then, with finality, "Let's dive into this mess, shall we?" The silence that followed was broken by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. The hearing had officially taken a turn. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages in front of him. He understood the gravity of what he was about to present. The room was already charged with tension. But this was where things got serious. "All right," Caldwell began, his voice calm but firm. "Let's take a step back, rewind the clock a few years." He tapped his fingers against the stack of documents, letting the moment hang. "Because this isn't the first time these allegations have surfaced." Lifting a printed news article, he angled it toward the committee members. When these claims first came to light, Representative Ilhan Omar dismissed them outright, called them absurd. She treated it as nothing more than a conspiracy theory. His eyes flicked toward Omar, who remained stone-faced, her fingers intertwined on the desk in front of her. But then, something happened. Caldwell paused, bracing for what came next. Caldwell continued, his voice steady. He picked up another document, this time a scanned copy of a marriage certificate, holding it up for emphasis. Then, the media uncovered a wedding certificate. And suddenly, Representative Omar had nothing more to say. He placed the document down, tapping the top of the page. She refused to comment, claimed she does not discuss her family or personal life. Caldwell let out a slow, deliberate breath. But the problem is, other people started talking. He picked up another file, scanning the text briefly before lifting his gaze toward the committee. Abda Hakim Osman, a key witness. A well-known figure in the Minneapolis Somali community went on record with the Daily Mail. And what did he say? Caldwell glanced down, reading aloud. In 2009, Ilhan Omar married her biological brother, Ahmed Elmi, so he could remain in the U.S. and attend college. A ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber, the weight of the accusation settling over the room like a thick fog. Caldwell leaned back slightly, his hands flat on the table. So now I ask the committee, is this really a story we're supposed to ignore? Silence. Then, the rapid clicking of cameras. The hearing delved deeper into uncharted territory, the tension in the chamber reaching a fever pitch. Every camera in the room was trained on Abdi Hakim Osman, the key witness from the white Minneapolis Somali community. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and straightened his posture. This was his moment, and he understood the gravity of what he was about to say. With measured deliberation, Osman placed his right hand on the Bible and swore in. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet resolute. I can confirm, without hesitation, that Representative Ilhan Omar married her biological brother, Ahmed S. Elmi, to secure legal immigration documents in the United States. A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. The room fell silent. Osman pressed forward, unwavering. At the time, Omar was already married in a religious ceremony to Ahmed Hirsi. However, because their marriage was not officially recorded under Minnesota state law, she was still able to legally marry Elmi on paper. He gestured to a stack of documents in front of him. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated, deliberate effort to obtain a green card for her brother. The weight of his statement settled over the room like a heavy fog. To speak on the matter now, but back then, she confirmed the marriage was real. A murmur spread through the room, lawmakers exchanging glances as the weight of Osman's words sank in. The cameras zoomed in on Omar, who remained composed but visibly tense. Omar let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. And yet, she countered, her voice steady but laced with irritation. Not a single credible government agency has found any wrongdoing. Not one. She shifted her gaze toward the committee members. Do you realize what's happening here? We are wasting taxpayer dollars on a conspiracy theory that has already been debunked time and time again. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, clearing his throat. With all due respect, Representative Omar, if the allegations were truly debunked, why does this issue keep resurfacing? Why do new documents keep emerging? Why do members of your own community continue to speak out? Omar's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Caroline Levitt interjected, her voice dripping with skepticism. You call this a waste of taxpayer dollars, she said, but isn't it a bigger waste if we ignore potential fraud? If there's nothing to hide, then why fight so hard to shut down the conversation? A tense silence followed. Omar's expression didn't waver, but the air in the room had shifted. The hearing was no longer just about the allegations. It was about who held the stronger argument, the more convincing narrative, and at that moment it was clear that the battle was far from over. Ignore. This is a serious allegation involving potential immigration fraud by a sitting member of Congress. The American people deserve answers. Omar straightened, her expression unreadable. And I have given them answers, she said firmly. Time and time again. But it seems that no matter how many times I refute these claims, no matter how many times actual investigative bodies dismiss them, certain individuals, her gaze flickered toward Osman and Caldwell, refuse to let this go. Russell didn't blink. Because questions remain, he countered. Because new information continues to surface. Because your denials, Representative Omar, have never been backed by full transparency. He picked up one of the documents from the table, holding it between his fingers. This isn't about politics. This isn't about party lines. This is about trust. It's about whether or not an elected official engaged in deception to circumvent U.S. immigration laws. He set the paper down. So, let's set aside the outrage for a moment and deal with the facts. Omar folded her arms. By all means, she said coolly, let's... The room sat on edge, the tension suffocating, as Russell flipped to the next page in his notes. Then let's talk about the discrepancies in your marriage records, he said. A slow, deliberate breath before speaking. Well, she said, her tone laced with calculated precision. It seems we finally have some clarity on what's at stake. Here. She tapped her fingers against the polished wood of the desk, letting her words settle before continuing. This isn't about partisanship. This isn't about political games. This is about the law. And if the law was broken, there must be consequences. Omar exhaled sharply, her composure beginning to show small cracks. The real question, she shot back, her voice tight, is why we are wasting taxpayer dollars on yet another baseless hearing, fueled by bad faith actors and conspiracy theorists. Levitt tilted her head. Bad faith? The evidence suggests otherwise. She gestured toward the growing pile of documents before them. Sworn testimony, official records, witnesses are willing to go on the record. So tell me, Representative Omar. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just a notch. How long do you expect the American people to ignore this? Omar's lips pressed into a thin line. I expect them to focus on real issues, she said, evenly. Not fabricated smears meant to tarnish my name and distract from the work I was elected to do. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Russell clasped his hands together. Then prove it, he said simply. Prove that these are smears. Prove your innocence. Omar hesitated for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for Levitt to catch it, and that was all she needed. Because, Levitt continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Right now, Representative Omar, the silence, it speaks volumes. The director laid it all out for us, didn't he? She continued, her voice now carrying a slight edge. Gross negligence? Check. Mishandling classified information? Check. A blatant disregard for the law? Absolutely. And yet, she let out a short, humorless chuckle. No charges, no consequences. Just another example of how the powerful get to play by a different set of rules. She turned her gaze back to Omar. And now, here we are again. Another high-profile politician. Another serious allegation. And the same script is playing out. Denials, deflections, attacks on the credibility of the investigation itself. Omar's expression remained impassive, but the tension in her shoulders was visible. Levitt leaned forward, her voice lowering slightly. Let me ask you something, Representative Omar. If any ordinary American engaged in immigration fraud, do you think they'd be standing where you are today? Or would they already be facing felony charges? Silence. She shook her head. The American people are tired of this. They're tired of watching one standard applied to them while Washington elites get a free pass. If we're serious about upholding the rule of law, then it shouldn't matter if your last name is Clinton, or Omar, or anyone else. The room was electric with tension, every camera lens focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Russell exhaled slowly before speaking. Representative Omar, do you have anything further to say? Omar straightened, her expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, she simply said, This is a waste of time. Levitt smirked. I bet you'd like it to be. It's a whole different game, isn't it? Levitt's voice dripped with frustration, her words deliberate, cutting. Then it's raids at dawn, indictments, congressional hearings with the media in a frenzy, ready to tear you apart before the facts even come out. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. Tell me, where was this same level of scrutiny when Hunter Biden's laptop was buried? Where was the outrage when classified documents were found in President Biden's garage next to his Corvette? A murmur rippled through the chamber, the tension tightening like a vice. Levitt leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping against the table in a slow, steady rhythm. And now, here we are again, staring at what looks like another blatant case of fraud, immigration fraud no less. And instead of asking the real questions, we're supposed to just accept the denials at face value? She scoffed. Sorry, but that's not how this works. Not anymore. Omar's jaw tightened, her fingers lacing together in front of her. She didn't break eye contact, but the weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. Russell finally exhaled, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Representative Omar, you've been given ample opportunity to respond. Do you deny under oath that you married your biological brother for immigration purposes? Omar sat still, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she simply said, I have already answered these ridiculous accusations. I will not dignify this political circus any further. A wave of hushed whispers spread through the room. Levitt shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. And there it is, she muttered. The same old playbook. Caldwell closed his folder, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Chairman, I think we all know where this is headed. Russell nodded slowly, the weight of the hearing settling over the chamber. Then let the record show that Representative Omar has declined to provide a direct answer to the allegations presented today. The sound of camera shutters clicking filled the silence. The hearing had reached a boiling point, and no one in that room was walking away unscathed. Much bigger issue, a system that selectively enforces the law based on political convenience. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every member seated before him. If an average American committed immigration fraud, they'd be prosecuted without hesitation. No media spin, no endless debates, just charges, a trial, and consequences. But when it's a politician, suddenly, it's untouchable. A murmur spread through the chamber, some nodding in agreement, others whispering in hushed tones. Russell tapped his fingers against the table. Let's be clear, this is not about personal attacks, nor is it about partisan theatrics. This is about integrity, about whether or not laws apply equally to everyone, regardless of their political status. He turned back to Omar. Representative? Omar, once again I ask, are you willing to categorically deny under oath that this marriage was fraudulent? Omar's lips pressed together. Then, after a long pause, she said, I have already denied these accusations. I will not participate in this charade. Russell leaned back, nodding slightly. Then let the record show that Representative Omar has declined to provide a direct sworn statement refuting these allegations. The tension in the room was suffocating. The weight of the moment bore down on everyone present. Levitt exhaled, shaking her head. Same old story, she muttered. Rules. For thee, but not for me. Russell straightened in his seat. I think it's time this committee makes a decision. Either we treat this as seriously as any other alleged case of immigration fraud, or we admit, once and for all, that some people in this country are simply above the law. The chamber was silent, save for the clicking of camera shutters. The hearing wasn't over, but the battle lines had been drawn, calculated impatience. Then, with a slow inhale, she finally spoke. Mr. Chairman, she said smoothly, what we're witnessing right now is exactly why the American people have lost faith in our institutions. She let that sit, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber. They see it. They see the double standards. They see the selective enforcement. They see politicians in power protecting their own while holding everyone else to a different set of rules. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering on Omar for just a moment before returning to Russell. And if we let this slide, if we shrug our shoulders and say, well, what can we do? Then we're not just complicit, Mr. Chairman, we're part of the problem. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some members exchanged glances. Others sat rigid, unwilling to react. Omar remained motionless, her jaw set tight, her expression unreadable. Russell exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers once against the stack of documents before him. Representative Levitt, he said, his voice calm but firm. I think the American people deserve an answer. He turned back to Omar. Representative Omar, one last time. Will you go on record, under oath, and categorically deny that this marriage was fraudulent? Omar held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with deliberate composure, she leaned into her microphone. I will not dignify this baseless attack with a response, she said, her voice cool and controlled. A silence fell over the chamber. Camera, shutters clicked. The tension was suffocating. Levitt let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. That, she said, leaning back in her chair, tells us everything we need to know. The hearing wasn't over, but the lines had been drawn. Regardless of the subsequent events, everyone in that room comprehended that the conflict was far from being resolved. Are there serious, unresolved questions about your integrity? The room tensed. Omar exhaled slowly, her expression carefully composed, but the weight of the question pressed down on every corner of the chamber. Russell folded his hands, his gaze steady. "Representative Omar," he said, his voice measured. "You've called. These allegations absurd, baseless. And yet, the documents, the testimony, they suggest otherwise. If you assert that all of this is fabrication, why don't you confront it directly? Why not provide a clear, unequivocal refutation backed by evidence?" Omar finally leaned forward. Her voice was sharp, deliberate. "Because this," she said, gesturing at the chamber, "isn't a hearing. It's a political stunt." She let the words hang. "A desperate attempt to discredit me, to distract from real issues, and to play into dangerous xenophobic narratives." Levitt let out a slow, unimpressed exhale. "Deflection," she murmured, shaking her head. "Classic." But Omar wasn't finished. "You speak of integrity, yet where is the integrity in amplifying falsehoods? Where is the integrity in weaponizing conspiracy theories to score political points?" A murmur moved through the room, some nodding in agreement, others stiffening. At the response, Russell didn't flinch. "Representative Omar, no amount of rhetoric changes the simple fact that these allegations exist, that they have persisted for years, and that, until they are fully and transparently addressed, they will cast a shadow over your position." Silence. The gravity of the moment settled in, thick and unshakable. Then Levitt, her expression cool and unimpressed, leaned forward once more. "Then let's address them," she said. "Right here. Right now." Omar let the words hang in the air, scanning the room, daring someone to challenge her outright. "It's about silencing voices that make you uncomfortable," she continued, her tone unwavering. "It's about fear. Fear that people like me, immigrants, women of color, Muslims, can rise to positions of power in this country." Leavitt tilted her head, unimpressed. "Spare us the victim narrative, Representative Omar," she shot back. "This isn't about your background. It's about your actions." Omar's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Russell exhaled sharply. "Enough with the rhetoric," he said. "You can try to turn this into a conversation about identity, about politics, about anything other than the facts. But facts don't care about narratives." He picked up the stack of documents in front of him. "We have sworn affidavits, financial records, statements that raise very real questions about whether or not you engaged in fraud. And what do we get in response? Deflection, accusations of bad faith, but no answers. Silence." Levitt tapped her nails against the table. "And that," she said, "is why this committee will not let this go. If the allegations are false, prove it. If they're true, then you, Representative Omar, should not be sitting in that chair." Omar folded her arms. "And if I refuse to engage in this farce?" Russell leaned back, his expression cold. "Then the American people will draw their own conclusions." Omar delivering a speech at a private event in 2014. This footage, recently uncovered, raises even more concerns about her associations and past statements. The grainy video played on, showing Omar speaking to a small audience. Though the audio was muffled, a subtitle overlay had been added, clearly displaying her words. Levitt clasped her hands together, watching the screen intently. "Interesting," she murmured. "Representative Omar, do you recall making these remarks?" Omar didn't flinch. "I give speeches all the time, Representative Levitt. You'll have to be more specific." Levitt's smirk widened. "Oh, don't worry, we will be." Russell turned back to Omar, his expression unreadable. "In this clip, you make statements that, in the context of today's discussion, warrant further scrutiny. You speak about immigration, about certain loopholes in the system, loopholes that, coincidentally, mirror the allegations made against you." Omar let out a dry chuckle. "That's quite a stretch, Mr. Chairman." Russell steepled, his fingers. "Is it? Or is it a pattern?" A tense silence filled the room. Omar glanced toward her allies, but they remained still. The pressure was mounting, and she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a battle over narratives, over power, Levitt leaned forward again, eyes locked onto Omar. Let's cut to the chase. Are you willing to deny under oath that you engaged in marriage fraud? Omar's jaw clenched. The room waited, with something dangerously close to amusement. It's how desperately some people in this room need me to be the villain in their story. A few murmurs rippled through the chamber. Omar's gaze swept across the committee, then locked onto Levitt. You sit here, Omar continued, playing a heavily edited, contextless clip in a language most of you don't even understand. And then, you tell everyone what it supposedly means, without providing a single translation, without any verification. She shook her head. That isn't an investigation, Representative Levitt. That's propaganda. Levitt smirked but said nothing. Marcus Russell cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Representative Omar, are you denying that you made statements of allegiance to Somalia? I'm denying the absurdity of this entire line of questioning, Omar shot back. Do you ask every immigrant in Congress to prove their loyalty? Or just the ones with names like mine? A sharp silence followed. Some lawmakers exchanged uneasy glances. Others scribbled notes, avoiding eye contact. Russell's expression remained unreadable. Representative Omar, this committee is seeking clarity. If this footage is being misrepresented, you have the opportunity to set the record straight. Omar leaned back, arms crossed. I don't owe you the dignity of defending myself against a bad faith attack. My record as an American legislator speaks for itself. Levitt shook her head, clicking her pen once. That's convenient. Omar exhaled sharply. No, Representative Levitt. That's reality. The chamber remained silent, the weight of the exchange settling over the room like an approaching storm. Your own words. We're here to determine whether those words and your actions warrant further investigation. Omar exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming against the desk. Let me make this clear, Mr. Chairman, she said evenly. I am a duly elected representative of the United States Congress. My loyalty is to my constituents, to the people who put me here, not to whatever political narrative you're trying to construct. Levitt leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then perhaps you can explain why you've repeatedly made statements that suggest otherwise? She tapped the desk twice. This isn't just about one speech, Representative Omar. There's a pattern here. Omar arched an eyebrow. A pattern, you say? Russell steepled his fingers. Yes, Representative Omar. Comments that undermine the United States, questionable financial dealings, allegations of immigration fraud. There are too many unanswered questions. Omar let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Right, because when a black Muslim woman in Congress speaks out, it's always an unanswered question. Her expression hardened. Meanwhile, half this chamber has members who've dined with dictators, spread conspiracy theories, and incited violence, and somehow they never find themselves under the microscope. A few Democratic lawmakers nodded, while their Republican counterparts remained still, their expressions unreadable. Leavitt's voice was cool. This committee isn't investigating half this chamber, Representative Omar. We're investigating you. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Omar's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Of course you are, she murmured. Republican lawmakers chuckled, while Democrats shifted in their seats. Omar, however, remained still, her expression unreadable. Levitt pressed on, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Hillary Clinton spent years accusing her opponents of corruption, yet somehow she managed to escape scrutiny for her private email server, for Benghazi, for foreign donations pouring into her foundation while she was Secretary of State. She tapped her pen against the desk for emphasis. And now, we're supposed to believe that you, Representative Omar, are above scrutiny too? That asking legitimate questions about your background, your statements, your financial dealings is some kind of political witch hunt? Omar finally let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly. Ah, the Hillary pivot, she mused, her tone dry. A classic move when the argument starts to fall apart. Leavitt's smirk didn't falter. Not a pivot, Representative Omar. Just a reminder that double standards are alive and well in Washington. Russell cleared his throat, signaling for the questioning to continue. Levitt leaned in slightly. So let's talk about these allegations. Omar held up a hand, cutting her off. No, let's talk about why this hearing is happening, in the first place. She turned her gaze to Russell. Mr. Chairman, let's not pretend this is about justice or integrity. This is about politics. It's about power. Levitt's eyes narrowed. It's about accountability, Representative. Omar let out a humorless laugh. Funny. Because accountability only ever seems to go one way in this town. About democracy being in danger, about the so-called threat to our institutions, but when it's their side under scrutiny, suddenly, investigations are political theater. Suddenly, asking basic questions is a witch hunt. She let out a low chuckle, shaking her head. How convenient. The Republican side nodded in agreement, while Democrats exchanged wary glances. Omar took a slow breath, adjusting her microphone before responding. It's interesting, Representative Leavitt, she said, her voice smooth but firm. You stand here pretending to care about accountability, about truth, yet the only investigations you support are the ones targeting your political opponents. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locked onto Levitt. Where was all this righteous anger when members of your own party attempted to overthrow a democratic election? Where was your moral outrage when your colleagues spread conspiracy theories that led to violence? Levitt's smirk didn't waver. Nice deflection, Representative Omar, but this hearing isn't about January 6th. It's about you and your actions. Or are you suggesting that because other people have done wrong, you should be exempt from scrutiny? Omar shook her head, a knowing smile playing on her lips. I'm suggesting, she said slowly, that this committee isn't interested in fairness or truth. It's interested in scoring political points. A tense silence followed, the weight of her words pressing against the room. Russell sighed, rubbing his temple before speaking. Representative Levitt, continue. Levitt leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Chairman, she said smoothly. I'm just getting started. You? Omar continued, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. You stand there, wagging your finger at me, questioning my patriotism, my right to sit here as a duly elected representative, and yet... She let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. The very people you defend, the very ones you refuse to question, have actively undermined our democracy. And you want to lecture me about respecting institutions? Leavitt smirked, unfazed. That's cute, Representative Omar. But here's the thing. You can try to spin this all you want, but facts are facts. You're facing credible allegations of immigration fraud. You've made repeated statements that many Americans find anti-American. And now, we have you on tape pledging allegiance to another country. So tell me, do you believe that kind of conduct is acceptable for a member of this Congress? Omar exhaled slowly, folding her hands. Representative Levitt, I took the same oath you did, to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And unlike some members of your party, I have never called for the overthrow of an election. I have never incited violence, and I have never supported political extremism. So no, I don't think I need a lecture from you on what it means to serve this country. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some approving, others skeptical. Levitt leaned forward. That's a nice speech, Representative Omar, but you still haven't answered the question. Omar's gaze didn't waver. No, Representative Levitt, I have answered it. You just don't like the answer. The tension in the room thickened, a quiet standoff settling between the two women. Russell cleared his throat, his voice clipped. Let's move on. The room, his expression unreadable. Let's keep this hearing focused, he said finally, his voice steady but firm. Levitt didn't look away from Omar. Gladly, Mr. Chairman, she said smoothly. Because I still have questions. Omar's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't break her composure. And I have answers, she replied, her voice laced with quiet defiance. Levitt leaned forward slightly, her tone measured, but laced with accusation. Representative Omar, let's talk about influence. You've repeatedly framed yourself as a champion of immigrants, of refugees, of marginalized communities. But isn't it true that your rhetoric and political positions have raised serious concerns about foreign entanglements? Isn't it true that some of your statements have been widely interpreted as sympathetic to regimes that oppose American interests? Omar's expression didn't shift. It's interesting how quickly advocacy for human rights becomes foreign entanglements. When it comes from a Muslim woman, she said, her voice smooth but sharp-edged. A few murmurs rippled through the chamber. Leavitt smirked. Oh, don't play the victim, Representative Omar. This isn't about your identity. This is about your words, your actions. Omar let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head slightly. Spare me the theatrics, Representative Leavitt. If this were truly about accountability, we'd be talking about the members of your party who supported an insurrection, who spread election lies, who put this country in real danger. But instead, you're sitting here, selectively outraged, trying to manufacture a scandal where none exists. Leavitt opened her mouth to respond, but Russell cut in, his voice firm. Enough, both of you. The tension crackled in the air, unspoken challenges lingering between them. Russell exhaled. Representative Leavitt, wrap up your line of questioning. Leavitt's gaze lingered on Omar for a beat longer before she leaned back in her chair, smirking. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Chairman. I think we've learned plenty already. Political party, not to an agenda, but to the American people. The weight of his words settled over the room. Omar remained composed, though her fingers curled slightly against the desk. Russell continued, his gaze steady. So, Representative Omar, let's put all the rhetoric aside. Let's put the deflections, the accusations, and the grandstanding aside. Do you categorically deny ever engaging in any form of immigration fraud? A pause. The air felt heavy with expectation. Omar met his gaze, her voice unwavering. I categorically deny any wrongdoing. Leavitt leaned forward, her smirk returning. That's convenient. But you see, Representative Omar, the American people aren't interested in convenient answers. They want the truth. Omar's expression remained unreadable. And the truth is, you don't actually care about facts. You care about narratives. If you did care about truth, this hearing would be focused on policy, on governance, on the real issues facing Americans, not political smears meant to delegitimize immigrants, Muslims, and anyone who doesn't fit your definition of patriotism. A few murmurs. The tension in the room was suffocating now. Russell sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, let's move on. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Motivated witch hunt designed to discredit a prominent progressive voice. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed lawmakers for reactions. Some Republicans praised the move, calling it a necessary step in holding elected officials accountable. Democrats, meanwhile, condemned it as a baseless attack rooted in xenophobia and political grandstanding. Omar herself remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath, issuing only a brief statement. These allegations are nothing more than an attempt to silence me and the communities I represent. I will not be intimidated and I will not back down. But inside her office, away from the cameras, the weight of the moment was undeniable. Her staff whispered among themselves, strategizing, preparing for what was to come. She sat at her desk, eyes scanning a flurry of incoming messages, some supportive, others dripping with vitriol. Caroline Leavitt, meanwhile, basked in the media attention. Interviews, headlines, viral clips, it was exactly what she had intended. In her mind, this wasn't just about Ilhan Omar, it was about sending a message. The battle lines had been drawn. The investigation was officially underway, and Washington was bracing for a fight that was far from over. Social media platforms erupted with debate, hashtags trending for days, some calling for justice, others for resistance. And at the center of it all stood Ilhan Omar. She walked through the corridors of Capitol Hill, her face composed, her posture unwavering. She had faced controversy before, been scapegoated, vilified, and targeted by critics. But this was different. This time, an investigation was real. A swarm of reporters lined the hallways, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of shouted questions. "Representative Omar, do you have any response to the committee's decision?" One journalist called out. She paused just briefly, her expression unreadable. "The truth always prevails," she said simply, before stepping into the elevator. The doors slid shut, silencing the outside world, but the battle was far from over. Meanwhile, Caroline Levitt sat in her office, watching the news coverage unfold. Arms crossed, a slow, satisfied smirk played at her lips. "The truth always prevails?" she murmured, shaking her head slightly. Her gaze flickered toward an aide, standing by the doorway. "Then let's make sure the American people finally get it." The investigation had only just begun, but it had already ignited a firestorm across Washington. This wasn't just about Ilhan Omar. It wasn't just about immigration fraud, political privilege, or partisan hypocrisy. It was about something far bigger, an enduring question that echoed beyond the walls of Congress. Who holds power accountable? Does justice apply equally, or does political influence dictate consequences? And most importantly, what happens when truth and politics collide? The answers, like everything in Washington, depended on who controlled the narrative. The real game had begun, and in this town, the fight was never about truth. It was about who had the power to define it.